Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're doing great. Today we're talking about why are Latter-day Saints leaving, and we're using a recent book and data set that has been published, which shines a little light on this question. Some of you perhaps have heard about the recent publication of a book called Torn, Why People We Love Are Leaving the Church and What We Can Learn from Them. This was published a few weeks ago by Jeff Strong. Jeff Strong, who is a past bishop, past mission president, and in his case, 3 of his 5 children have left the church. So this is a question that has been on his mind for personal reasons, but has been on the mind of course, many others. I've done musings in the past where we've explored some of these topics. Now, one of the things to note about this book in particular is that his main thesis, what he's arguing and presenting data on, is that a large share of once active, believing Latter-day Saints have stepped away in the last 25 years, and that this is a serious but often misunderstood reality. So Jeff's angle is to try and tabulate the reasons for which people are leaving and try and shine light on that misunderstood reality to help people better understand what's going on and why people are leaving. Now, Jeff contends in his book that most who leave the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints don't do so casually, but they often wrestle with doubts or pain or disillusionment for years before stepping away. So it's kind of a struggle that these people go through. And his central thesis, at least my takeaway, is that when people disaffiliate from the church, when they leave the church, that it's less of a faith crisis and more of a trust and culture crisis within the church. I'm going to talk more about that a bit later because I think that's a really interesting and compelling point when it comes to understanding these trends and what is going on. Now, he's positioning his work in this book as both, data-driven and trying to present this information, which we'll go through, and also pastoral in a sense. So it's like, here's the social science analysis, but here's some faith-affirming reflections, and he's trying to help active members and church leaders and others understand what's going on. And, from his point, 3 of his 5 kids that left, he's trying to understand the problem and suggest, some at least consideration, if not a changed course of action. Before we get into it, let's listen to a short clip of Jeff on another podcast where he walks through some of the highlights of the data that we'll go through step by step.
So let's talk about that. Why are
Yeah.
people leaving?
There are 4 primary reasons. The first one is lifestyle. The second one is church history. The third one is disagreement with past or present church social issues or positions or doctrines. And the final one is negative church experience. So let me just bring those to life a little bit. Lifestyle is only about 6% of members, but it's just not working for them, right? And it might be they don't want the expectations or responsibilities. That's kind of the narrative that we hear. But sometimes it's just depleting to them, right? It tires them out. They feel guilt and shame. They sort of feel hollowed out. And so it just isn't working, and so they step away. Church history is pretty clear to everybody. It's 42% of people in our survey suggested that was the primary reason they stepped away. And so it's the stuff that we're familiar with. It's concerns about inconsistencies in our church history narrative, or translation of the Book of Mormon or Book of Abraham, or the behavior of prophets like Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, or polygamy. The social issues are the ones we're all familiar with, right? Sexual identity, gender equality, financial transparency, 33%. And then, to me, the most interesting one, church experience, about 18%. And what that's primarily about is really faithful, devout people that feel like, gosh, this church doesn't feel Christ-centered, right? It feels institutional. We talk a lot about prophets and temples and obedience, but less about the carpenter of Bethlehem, Jesus, right? The Good Samaritan, service, compassion, kindness. And so they feel tension because they feel like our church it doesn't embody the living water and bread of life that they've come to love in the gospel. David, I actually think that 4th bucket is a little bigger than the data might suggest, and that's because it speaks to cultural challenges, right? Because we all know that we are the Church of Jesus Christ, that we want to be focused in Christ, But for some people, they're not experiencing that in their church experience. And I actually think that factor, I refer to these as waves in the book, but I think that wave sort of crashes over the top of the other three, making them worse.
All right. And in addition to that data, the core claim of Jeff's book, and I'll quote here a portion of it, where he says that the research that he conducted, and we'll talk about what is that research, is it any good, should we rely on it? But he says the research suggests that nearly 40% of once active Latter-day Saints in the United States have stepped away from church participation over the past 25 years. So he's got this different kind of breakdown into categories about why people left and what their issues were. Again, we're going to talk about these. But this overarching data point, nearly 40% of once active, once believing Latter-day Saints have stepped away from the church in the past, since 2000, basically. Now, let's wrap our arms around this data set. Is it reliable? What is it? Let's first talk about its strengths. Now, one thing that I think is noteworthy about what Jeff has done is that this is potentially, maybe the church has done something and just not publicly released it or whatever, but this is potentially the largest LDS-focused study on disaffiliation, at least that is publicly shared. Again, maybe the church has been quietly doing stuff and who knows, but in terms of what you and I can access and understand, this, I think, is the largest study of disaffiliation with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, the core data set that Jeff is using derives from a survey that he and a team he assembled conducted in 2023 involving around 15,000 individuals. And then to figure out what questions to ask, they did about a dozen focus groups. They did over 20 in-depth one-on-one interviews. And then after that core 2023 survey, they did 4 follow-up surveys in 2024 and 2025 with smaller segments. And so we assembled some scholars from a variety of fields to help design the survey. What questions should we ask? How should we ask them, etc. But as he notes in his book, quote, advisory input strengthened the design and interpretation of the study, but does not eliminate the methodological limitations associated with non-probability self-selected sampling, end quote. We'll talk more about that in just a moment when we get into the weaknesses. But the point is, he's not just a guy doing it on his own. A strength could be that he's trying to assemble all these, smart people to do the best they can in light of the weaknesses that their survey design has. We'll talk about those in a moment. Final thing to say here, and again, I quote from the book, participants represented the full continuum of church relationship and activity, including former members, inactive members, marginally active members, conflicted active members, and fully active members reporting strong satisfaction with the church. Okay, so he's trying to, get a broad sample. As he pointed out in the previous quote, it's a non-probable self-selected sample. So now let's talk about what that means and what the weakness is of Jeff's data set that informs his book, Torn. Again, quoting from Jeff. This study does not claim statistical representativeness of the full LDS population. Because no single comprehensive public sampling framework exists for current and former members, and here I might say, not that we know of, again, maybe the church has been doing this behind closed doors, but continuing to quote Jeff, particularly those who have disaffiliated, probability sampling was not feasible. The study therefore uses a large, diverse, non-probability sample designed to capture a broad spectrum of the lived LDS experience. Its findings are best interpreted as substantial descriptive and analytical insights rather than precise population estimates or establishing causal relationships. So all of that is to say, what is he trying to, say with that? This is not a representative data. When you do a statistical sample and random sampling, and you're trying to take a large enough number of people, let's say 1,000 people, but you've randomly selected them. Therefore, the statistical probability increases that small data set is representative of the broader population. So you could survey 2 or 5 or 10,000 people, but you're not going to really change the data, because if you have a sufficiently large, let's say 1,000 people, but you do it randomly, you're able to extrapolate within certain margins of error, usually like 2 to 4% margin of error. You see this all the time with political polling and opinion polling and things like that, right? But that's not what Jeff has done here. He didn't do a random sample and just try and randomly find Latter-day Saints in the population. He was directly soliciting input from Latter-day Saints over the internet. So he partnered first with Faith Matters and sent survey invitations to their audience. Faith Matters is kind of like a leftist-friendly, progressive-friendly group. They focus on, inclusivity and LGBT and all that kind of stuff. Or in the words of Ralph Hancock, I may quote him later, kind of a philosopher, LDS guy. He called Faith Matters a group that wants to soften the moral demands of Christian faith in order to accommodate a late modern sensibility of relativistic acceptance. Basically, the speak your truth, God is love, whispering sweet nothings in your ear and requiring nothing of you type of people. That's not to say everyone involved in Faith Matters believes and thinks that way, but from my observation, that's kind of the type of people that congregate there and associate there more likely than let's say, a Orthodox, traditional believing Mormon themselves. Anyway, so Jeff partnered with Faith Matters, this group, sends out a survey to their audience. He promoted the survey in Facebook groups, distributing it on LDS-themed email lists, going on podcasts, trying to solicit input. So again, this is not a person going to random people and trying to have a statistical probability reflective of the broader population. This is someone going around saying, hey, if you're Mormon or were Mormon or kind of still are Mormon or whatever, will you please come fill out the survey? That presents and creates the core weakness of this data set, was that, when you're going on Faith Matters to that particular group, and that is like your core nucleus of respondents when you're starting, that means that you're going to skew the data. Not only will it not be statistically representative of the broader whole, but also that the data itself might be skewed. Another weakness of what Jeff is doing is that this is U.S. only. Yet most church members globally live outside the United States now, right? And so these are people who respond to, listening on podcasts, seeing a social media post. So these are also people who are like very online. You're not really getting like the rural farmer Mormon who doesn't have social media or whatever. So again, these are limitations of what Jeff is doing. Now, there's a problem when you're doing self-reporting like this, right? A voluntary survey about why people leave the church will over-recruit people with strong feelings on both ends. People who left, people who have stayed and think it's wrong to leave, etc. But when you get a voluntary survey like this, you're attracting the people who are passionate about it rather than just randomly showing up to someone and saying, tell me what you think. I think humans have a natural tendency to try and make themselves look good. Therefore, when they are volunteering for a survey, that's more likely the response you're going to get. So rather than answering, oh, I was up late night partying with friends or, watching pornography or whatever, and therefore I didn't feel like getting up for church, rather than saying anything like that, a respondent is going to be more likely to say, oh, well, I concluded that Joseph was a fraud, or I read the CES letter and I realized it was all a fraud, etc. Right? Rather than admitting any guilt or fault or casting oneself in a negative light, particularly when you're volunteering for a survey, right? You're going to try and make yourself look good. You're going to shift the blame elsewhere. You're going to move the locus of control externally rather than internally. It's someone else's fault. It's what someone else did. It's not what I did. It's not what So self-reporting like this should be taken with a huge grain of salt, right? It's very human to put the blame on other people, to have that external locus of control. Oh, Joseph was a fraud, or church leaders were lying, or, rather than, I didn't do the work. I didn't do much research. I didn't gain a testimony. I wasn't wanting to sacrifice, whatever, right? Like, it's very common to put the blame on other people. Therefore, these self-reportings, we should have that huge grain of salt. And so I think this undermines, or at least taints, the core headline of this, 40% that Jeff talked about. Here's actually how he himself wrote in the book, quote, "It is also important to note that the way any of us explain our decisions or motives to others is sometimes subject to our own biases and perceptions, and our deep need for inner congruency and validation. This complicates how we might interpret people's explanations for their choices. And for most of us, motives are more complex than we might understand, acknowledge, or communicate." So these 4 waves that you heard Jeff talk about in that podcast clip describe how people explain their leaving the church. That may not be the same as the true cause, or it might mischaracterize or put in a flattering point of view for them, how those issues impacted them. So let's get into it a little bit. Let's go over some highlights. So again, the big headline here, 40% of formerly active members have left in the last 25 years. Jeff writes in the book that to be thorough in the survey, we approached this question in 3 ways. First, we directly asked respondents if they had stopped participating themselves, and 42% of their survey respondents said that they had. Again, I'm no longer going to give qualifiers as we go through all this data. I think by this point, with these qualifications, you understand this is not statistically reliable, this might be skewed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Nonetheless, it is an interesting and valuable data set to look at despite those qualifications. So I'm just going to present the data at this point, but it's up to you to kind of remember those limitations and qualifications. So again, he asked respondents if they themselves had stopped participating. 42% said that they had. And then they asked for an estimate of how many in their immediate and birth families had stopped participating. So not asking the respondent about themselves, but just saying, hey, in your family circles and close friends and so forth. And that was 48%. And then third, they asked how many of their Latter-day Saint high school friends had stopped attending. And that was 47. So 42, 48, 47, all of this kind of substantiating the broader 40%. Part of why they're asking these different questions is to get at things in a different way. This was some of the pollsters that, you remember the Trump and Clinton election, and all the pollsters were like, oh, Hillary Clinton's got this in the bag and she's going to win. And all these polls said Clinton, Clinton, Clinton. Of course, then Trump won. And when you go back and look at the pollsters, there were like a teeny tiny handful. And one was Trafalgar. And my recollection here, because I know a colleague of mine was involved in that poll in 2016. And the way they correctly polled Trump winning was not asking people, who are you voting for? Because with all the Trump 2015, 2016, controversy, many people were embarrassed to admit that they voted for Trump. So when they were asked by someone, they would, Clinton or whatever, right? To make themselves look good and not admit what they were privately actually going to do in the ballot box. And so what this Trafalgar pollster did, my recollection, is that they asked people, not who are you voting for, but who do you think your neighbor is voting for? And that allowed the individual to not look good or bad, but just to kind of point to the other person. But now that the pollster's asking, they're not going to accurately say who I think my neighbor is voting for. They're going to say who they want to win because they want to help their guy or gal. So kind of a clever way to get around those issues. And they correctly, got it for Trump, contrary to everybody else. So I think that's kind of what Jeff is doing. Like, let's not only directly ask people about their own situation, but let's ask about their family members. Let's ask about their high school friends. And it gives people an opportunity to target a percentage that's more realistic of them, but they don't have to answer that way. Anyways, okay, let's get into these waves. Jeff mentioned the 4 of them. Let's start with the first. This is the lifestyle wave. 6% of people citing this as their primary factor for leaving the LDS church. Now, this was a so-called contributing factor for 20 to 30% of people, right? So people in the survey were able to say, well, this is the number one, but then these issues contributed. 20 to 30% is a very broad range. I found it kind of weird how Jeff and his team were like, it was a contributing factor for 20 to 30%. I don't quite know, and I didn't pick up on in the book why that range is so broad. Nonetheless, a lot of people said lifestyle contributed to the reasons, why I left. For those watching the video, here is the graphic showing the most frequently cited issues within this umbrella of lifestyle. So 34% of people indicated the controlling culture of the church as a reason for their deciding to leave. 29% saying the strain on their mental health, and then 25% indicating guilt and shame. And then tiny percentages, single digit, for excess time demands and missionary pressure. Jeff writes in the book that Wave 1 people describe a growing sense that the demands and rhythms of church life have become unsustainable, emotionally draining, or misaligned with their capacity and season of life. So people who want a different lifestyle, they're not operating on the same rhythm of church culture and expectations. Again, this is a minor one compared to the other more significant ones, including wave number 2. This is church history and truth claims. 42% of survey respondents saying this was their big reason, and it was a contributing factor for another 40 to 50%. So this is affecting basically everybody who's responding to the survey saying that they have left. Breaking that down, the most frequently cited issues under this umbrella of church history and truth claims: 39% doctrines and truth claims, 28% problematic history, 12% troubling temple practices, 12% polygamy and its legacy, 9% distrusting leaders. So heavily doctrines, truth claims, history, right? These are people who are, for example, reading the CS letter and coming to the conclusion that, oh, what the church says is true, it's clearly false. Look at all these evidences and the Gish Gallop of all the, many reasons why the Book of Abraham must be a fraud and Joseph was a con man and all this stuff that I've responded to elsewhere and others more capable than I have, and I think is not a reason to abandon the gospel of Jesus Christ at all. And often these claims, I think, are full of holes and misrepresentations, and that there are compelling and substantiating answers for a lot of these things. Before I opine more on that, let's get into what Jeff wrote. He said, these people in Wave 2 encounter historical, doctrinal, or institutional information that conflicts with what they were taught or assumed about the church's origins and truth claims. For many, the deepest rupture is not learning of troubled things, it is concluding they no longer know who or what to trust. They are often less disturbed by the actual historical problems, although for many those are troubling enough, and more disturbed by how they believe church leaders have handled them. And Jeff puts in his book here the typical triggers that causes someone to leave the church over one of these historical or doctrinal issues. So the triggers include polygamy, racism, Book of Mormon and Book of Abraham translation, prophetic fallibility, aspects of the temple endowment, learning of minimized or withheld historical information, and official church explanations perceived as incomplete, defensive, or misleading. Okay, so I want to pause briefly here to say that it's not shocking. Like, how can a church, the official position of the church is that its founder, a man who talked face to face with God, was also effectively and purportedly under the Lord's direct command an adulterer, a pedophile, and a scoundrel. I mean, this is directly insinuated in the Gospel Talkbooks essay on polygamy and in the Saints book. How can you have that be a position of the church? Here's this guy who saw, God and did all these things for the restoration, translated the Book of Mormon, and then he acted and behaved this way. How can you not expect people who are told to believe and reconcile those two things to not leave en masse? Now, granted, polygamy, landed at 12% for a lot of these people, but as you, I think, have seen, a lot of these primary influences also show up as contributing influences. Like, there's a lot of cross-pollination of why people leave, what breaks their shelf, right? And so on this particular topic of polygamy, the church agrees with all the anti-Mormons about Joseph's actions with 14-year-old girls and marrying other men's wives, and or sealing himself to them and lying publicly to Latter-day Saints. And of course, there's all these reasons about why he had to do that, and the Lord commanded him to, based on ridiculous, weak claims decades later by people about the flaming sword and all this nonsense that just isn't true. Well, no wonder people are struggling with it, and that is the active position of the church. right? I think it's wrong. I think it's incorrect. I've talked about that across a number of musings, and this is just one example. But you can see when we get into things like racism or Book of Abraham or the temple or all these things, on the one hand, I can kind of sympathize with some of these people who encounter this information. It's new to them. They don't have support from really any other people. They have maybe LDS apologists who they find untrustworthy or lacking credibility. They have the institutional church that isn't really saying or engaging with the material. And then they have all these influencers and podcasts and John DeLynns and resources and Faith Matters and all these online forums just shouting in their ear about, well, see, look, this is a reason why Joseph Smith was a fraud, or why, the church isn't true, the gospel, wasn't actually restored, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can sympathize with, this is a very hard wilderness to traverse when you don't have a lot of support. You yourself don't really understand this stuff because you weren't told before, and now you're encountering it, and you have all these vocal people on the one side, and then you just don't really have a lot of people engaging on the other side. And you, this theoretical you, typically has a very thin testimony, or at least a thin intellectually grounded testimony, understanding church history, researching any of these issues, knowing about the credibility of these things. You just read something, oh, Joseph Smith said this, so clearly he's a scumbag, scoundrel. But like, you don't dig into it. You, again, proverbial you don't dig in it to realize that's like a third-hand quote that someone said 42 years later. And now you're just like throwing it all away because, oh, I had this faith crisis over this historical issue. And you don't actually, like, again, there isn't a sophistication with many people to suss out these problems. They just read this quote online and someone, says, oh, look, it's in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, and therefore it must be true. And as I've shared on many musings, I think this is part of the reason that many people leave, is because they encounter this information. The church has embraced all these things that not embraced. The church has aligned itself with saying Joseph did say this and Joseph did do that based on quotes from enemies or people decades later, and have concocted this historical foundation that has a lot of cracks, and people encounter one of those cracks, and now I think Jeff is right in the sense that you don't know who to trust or what to trust, because what the heck, I should also note that this wave number 2 has similar findings from the 2013 Faith Crisis Report. If you recall anything about that, this was done by, Terrell Givens and John DeLynn back in the day, and a bunch of, a couple dozen people, presented to Elder Uchtdorf. Was he in the first presidency at the time? I don't recall. And so this was in 2013. They had 3,000 respondents in that survey. They also solicited via social media, so it had its own similar challenges. And in that particular report, everyone who responded to their survey believed at one time that the church was true, but most no longer believe that was the case. So this was like an early, smaller data set compared to what Jeff was doing. And in that report, again, 2013, the stated reasons for loss of faith amongst the vast majority of people were, I ceased to believe the doctrine, I studied church history and lost my belief, I lost a faith in Joseph Smith, I lost faith in the Book of Mormon. These things are all intertwined, really wrapped around church history and doctrine. That's really the foundation, because if you don't believe those, then you're not going to have faith and believe Joseph Smith to be credible. You're not going to consider the Book of Mormon to be true if you think that the historical representations are bogus for some reason. And in that Faith Crisis Report, they broke down the reasons under this umbrella, like church history, for example. And so ranking the primary factors within the historical issues that people had, it boiled down to Book of Abraham and polygamy were the top ones. And much lower than that were the blacks in the priesthood, DNA in the Book of Mormon, Masonry in the temple, multiple versions of the first vision. What's interesting, and again, these people there were some, like Clayton Christensen was involved in this. There was a bit of credibility here for these people to do it, and tied into various church staff and President Uchtdorf. And 2 months later, so I'm not establishing causation here, but this report comes out, and then 2 months later is when we get the first of the gospel essays published addressing most of these issues. blacks in the priesthood, first vision, Book of Abraham, polygamy, and so forth. And on the polygamy issue, I think it's interesting that for a long time the church just avoided talking about it. No one was questioning it. We didn't have the Joseph Smith papers that had surfaced a lot of these things and incongruities with the official narrative. And that the church didn't really openly engage on this until they discovered that more people were leaving the church because of just the lack of transparency than the issue itself, right? It wasn't the people didn't have as much problem with like the claims or the doctrine or the issue as with not being fully like disclosing of what was actually going on. I should also note that the CES letter was published in April of 2013, which is after this survey was done, this faith crisis survey. They did it in 2011, and then they produced the report in 2013. So the CES letter didn't affect the data in that report, but certainly a decade plus of being out there and impacting a lot of people definitely impacts Jeff's data set. So on the historical issues, again, like I just think you look at that, some of these things that have come out in the gospel essays where the church has been more forthcoming, the Book of Abraham and others. I've done many musings on this stuff, and people come to these conclusions about, on the Book of Abraham. It's like, oh, well, look, Joseph, clearly what we have isn't what Joseph said it was. And it all rests on this mischaracterization of the fact that we don't have the vast majority of what Joseph had access to. Right. And so that people come to these stringent conclusions based off of poor data, misinformation, whatever. And people base their theological, their testimony on just these little passing arguments that come in that just have shallow, hollow, sandy foundations. So I'm sympathetic on this historical one because I think most people have not dug in and done the research. And then you look at the Brian Hales anesthesiologists of the world, who is the like core person cited by the church for the polygamy issue. And the guy, I think, lacks credibility because he's just his website and his books are just full of all these ridiculous assumptions and inconsistencies. And so I've been openly critical in these past, many musings, not just on that topic, but others where I do feel like there are issues we have to come to terms with that the church leaders are concluding what they do and teaching what they have based off of scholars who are, I don't think, acting in good faith and with the right conclusions, etc. So I'm somewhat sympathetic here when someone with a very shallow intellectual understanding of these issues encounters a little bit of information online and then they struggle to, process it. They're not doing the work. They're not reading all the Joseph Smith papers. They're not digging in, most of them, right? And so it's tough. It's a battlefield with all these landmines out there, and people step on one and blow up, and they don't know where to tiptoe, and they don't know, how to survive and navigate that, and they don't know who to trust. Again, I think it's not surprising that we see people struggling as they have. And then they see the church kind of forced into more transparency with the gospel essays and the internet and all these things. And then they see the church being a laggard on that issue rather than leading out on it. And, now that you are getting caught, or now that people are complaining, you're finally being transparent. And so I just think radical transparency across the board is best, including on things like the William Clayton journals, which I've talked about before. Because if we want to really resolve these historical issues, we can't be relying on Brigham and others who were manipulating Joseph's history. We can't be, only relying upon the history that we can fully reconcile with what we currently believe. We have to look at what is the actual truth, which might be uncomfortable, shedding some of the traditions of our fathers along the way as a result. Okay, wave 3. This is church social positions. 33% of individuals cited this as their primary, and 50 to 60% of people cited this as a contributing factor. And within that umbrella of church social positions, 33% saying LGBTQ plus sexual identity kind of stuff was their big hang up and objection. 27% the financial stewardship. Racism was 20%. presumably blacks in the priesthood, like historical racism, not current racism, I'm guessing. 13% gender equality, so like women in the priesthood kind of stuff. 7% abuse and unrighteous dominion. Here's what Jeff says. Wave 3, people experience a collision between church doctrines, positions, policies, or culture and their conscience, particularly when they perceive harm to vulnerable individuals. This wave is experienced as a moral cost. It is not abandoning faith, but honoring conscience. And then Jeff says the typical triggers here are LGBTQ plus treatment and theology, particularly if it involves the individual or loved ones. So, hey, my brother is trans now, and oh, the church, I don't like your position, so I'm leaving the church type of deal. Financial transparency, priorities, and the for-profit business ventures of the church are cited as a typical trigger. Paying tithing to the church as a requirement for baptism and temple ordinances, gender inequality and exclusion, and then the handling of abuse or harm and a perceived bias for protecting the institution. These are the typical triggers, according to Jeff and his data set, for why people are citing these social positions. Clearly, these are far more left-leaning people who are struggling to reconcile their, postmodern leftist viewpoints with the gospel or church culture. Final one, wave 4, church experience and spiritual depletion. This is 18% and a contributing factor for 30 to 40%. Breaking down the data, 31% cited spiritual emptiness when coming to church. 26% said a lack of belonging, the same amount for social exclusion. You get a little bit of judgmental culture and a tiny amount of marginalization of singles. Jeff says that these disaffiliated members describe church participation that is no longer spiritually nourishing, Christ-centered, or life-giving, even when belief in God and Jesus Christ remains. And so, again, these things heavily overlap and are intertwined. Someone who has, a trans family member and now is objecting to the church's proclamation on the family is unlikely to attend church, and if they do, feel enlivened by the Spirit and feel have a soft heart and all these things, right? Like these things compound and connect one between another. What was interesting in Jeff's data is that he alleges that this disaffiliation, as he called it, people leaving the church, is accelerating. He presents this chart in particular, starting from 2000, showing that in the 5-year kind of chunks of years since, that things have been greatly increasing. Here's what he says. Perhaps the most alarming finding in our research is not just the total number leaving, but the speed at which they are leaving. Using the decade 2000 to 2009 as a baseline, the rate of disaffiliation in our survey multiplied dramatically over the next 3 successive 5-year periods. The exact rates of this acceleration, 3, 6, and 11x, should be interpreted cautiously. It is possible that a survey bias may exist here. People who have been out of the church longer, i.e., they left before 2010, may have been less likely to take our survey. If true, the acceleration rate could be somewhat overstated. The important point is not the exact magnitude of the acceleration, but that it appears to be happening, a conclusion supported by numerous other credible studies. So this trend is corroborated elsewhere, but the specific multipliers, the 3, 6, 11, should be held loosely. So clearly, all the social media and everything has given rise to information spreading laterally between people rather than just from the church or apologist organizations or anti-Mormon groups. You just have way more conversation happening now, which kind of creates this compounding effect. So who knows what that rate is? And I think his qualifier is right and probably conservatively stated. If someone left the church before 2010, chances are quite high that over 15 years later, they're not even going to be operating in communities, social media communities, where they would see Jeff's survey invitation. And so people who have left, granted, a lot of people who leave the church can't leave it alone type of deal, and they remain involved in ex-Mormon communities and social media, etc. But there's some contingent who, he may not be capturing that very well. Okay. Now, he has this chart where he asks which statement best describes your current beliefs amongst the respondents in this data set. These are all people who self-identified as previously being completely or mostly active. As you can see here in the visual, 44% on the right are saying that they're no longer active. So this is where we're getting our kind of 40-ish% data point. But on the other side, it's 56% of people who say that they are active currently. But then you look at the breakdown, 25% of people, of the overall respondents, say that they are a true, literal believer. They're all in. 13% of his respondents say that they're active, they believe most things, and they're mostly content. Excuse me. And then 18% of people say that they're active, but they no longer believe the church is what it claims. Now, that can mean any number of things. I don't believe the gospel is true, or I believe the gospel is true, but I believe the church has apostatized a little bit, or like there's a lot of nuance in there about being active, but no longer believing the church is what it claims. Like that can mean different things to different people, obviously. So there's quite a spectrum here. And the question then is, for these people who are struggling, who are disaffiliating, or who are active, kind of half in, half out, struggling with their faith, or maybe strong in their faith, but just skeptical of the church institution, etc., which I know a lot of people who fall into that camp. For these individuals, where do they turn and where do they get help? Jeff asked this question, and here is a chart that he has titled Resources People Used and How Helpful They Were. So if you look at the data, you'll find that amongst all the respondents, 54% of individuals said that they found non-official LDS sources helpful. And then 59% said non-LDS religious resources were helpful. So people from other faiths, right? Because a lot of these people are leaving the church to go into other denominations or no denominations. But I want to contrast that first one with the third one on the bottom left. So again, 54% of people saying it was helpful to have non-official Latter-day Saint resources to help them. But official LDS sources, only 7% of people said that those were helpful. So, non-official sources, say like Sunday Musings, but any number of online publications and podcasts and social media accounts and whatever, right? You might argue that these non-official sources tackle current events more. They address secularism. They're tackling issues that church leaders aren't talking about at all or hardly at all. This encompasses kind of influencer culture. Granted, social media is listed separately here. 35% of people saying that that was helpful for them. 59% saying social media was neutral. Getting some help, not getting some help, kind of balanced. But you get this influencer culture of just, again, lots of voices, lots of people talking about this stuff. And I've seen this. I've frankly felt this myself. So I can sympathize with people who look at the official LDS sources and it feels corporate. It feels correlated. It is correlated. It feels safe and sanitized. Some people would consider that predictable. Some would consider it boring. My mom shared with me some weeks ago, after the little anecdote popped in my head, after General Conference, the last General Conference, she said they were in her Relief Society meeting. And I don't think I need to keep this quiet because there's no one's names or anything like that. But the teacher was like, all right, and what was your favorite part of General Conference? What did you enjoy the most, type of thing? And just like silence, crickets. Nobody had anything. And so my mom, in relating this story, was, reflecting on that circumstance and the General Conference that produced that circumstance, that disengagement and silence. And I've done musings on like the decline of boldness in General Conference and all the things and the slow stain, right? Where you just get this like kind of safe, predictable, teddy bear Jesus, kind of stuff. And so little wonder then that contrasted against the corporate and the correlated, people are gravitating more to non-official voices who maybe have a strong testimony, maybe don't, maybe they're somewhere in the middle, but they feel authentic and they feel human and they feel like a fellow traveler. No wonder we're hearing podcasts being cited all the time in gospel doctrine and elsewhere, right? And so here I want to point out that even if just data is not representative, it's not statistically significant because it wasn't structured that way, this difference, contrasting the gravitation towards the official LDS sources and the non-official LDS sources. That chasm, 54% non-official, 7% finding the official sources helpful. That difference to me is fascinating, and I think it's informative. So even if the data set isn't fully representative, the fact that within this pool of people that Jeff has gotten, that there's this strong divergence or difference between those, I think that is significant. It may not be the precisely statistically correct number, but the fact that within this pool of nearly 20,000 people that Jeff's team talked to, that this is the split that you see, that is, I think, very significant. It's certainly enlightening. And if I was to quibble with this particular question, I would say, well, what does it mean to be helpful? Again, the title is Resources People Used and How Helpful They Were. Well, does it mean that they were helpful in getting them to stay in the church and bolster their testimony? Was it helpful to them in understanding church history in a way that retained faith versus not? Was it helpful in letting them lead? Like, helpful is, again, very subjective. Speaking of subjective, I want to share a portion of one review that I found from Dan Ellsworth. I thought he did a pretty good review on the Interpreter Foundation. I'm going to read a portion of his review of Jeff's book, Torn. Dan writes that a fatal flaw in surveys like the ones offered by Jeff Strong is that he asked questions about past experiences that involve a broken relationship with the church institution and broken relationships with countless people who were part of those respondents' church experiences. The information gathered in Strong's study certainly included enormous amounts of negatively reprocessed and rewritten past experiences. Furthermore, much of that negative reprocessing is actively facilitated by podcasts that transition their listeners to replacement narratives of grievance. I have no doubt that Strong's qualitative data shows strong convergences in narratives because those narratives are offered prepackaged in podcasts and other media and reinforced in online groups that steer people toward negative heuristic processing. All right, a bunch of fancy words. He's basically saying, these people who have a negative experience with the church for any number of reasons, the doctrine, the culture, the social, the whatever, or all of the above, they have these negative experiences, and then they basically have group therapy and online podcasts. They listen to Mormon stories or and they're getting all this validation in processing those negative experiences and cementing them in their brain in a particular perspective that then informs, not only current relationships with family or other church members and how they view the church right now, but it kind of solidifies one particular viewpoint and lens through which you look at those past experiences that you had in your life. So to Dan's point, kind of no wonder that you see the data in Jeff's data set skew the way that it does when you have these negative experiences being the focal point and all of these voices online that are kind of entrenching and solidifying that viewpoint. Dan's review then shares this example from Jeff's book. So this is from Torn, and then Dan is going to comment on this example. So first, the example from Jeff's book. Jay was a longtime professor at one of the church's universities, faithful, devoted, and widely admired for both his character and contribution. After years of service, he came to a major fork in the road. His 18-year-old son shared with his parents that he was bisexual. Suddenly, Jay was torn between love for his job and loyalty to the church and his love for his son. A private, thoughtful man, he carried the tension quietly. After a great deal of soul-searching, he and his wife made a deeply personal decision of conscience. To privately show support for their son, they directed part of their tithing to organizations that assisted LGBTQ+ individuals. This coincided with the university's new requirement for faculty ecclesiastical endorsements. When asked by his bishop if he was a full tithe payer, Jay was honest. He described the anguish of balancing fidelity to the church and university with his love for and desire to support his son. The bishop revoked his endorsement, and Jay was dismissed from his job. Years of faithful service, his character, and his family's well-being carried insufficient weight. The decision hinged on a general handbook definition of tithing. When Jay asked whether there was still a place for a man like him and a family like his in the church or at the school, the bishop's answer made it clear there wasn't. Here is what Dan says. Here, Jay is presented as a victim of the church. We are given no indication that he is a mature adult who understands that his church employment requires adherence to standards, and who fully accepts his own responsibility to adhere to those standards. Notice that Jay did not arrive at the various obvious conclusion that he could pay tithing and also contribute to other organizations that reflect his concerns. Having adopted an external locus of control, Jay's narrative places the problem entirely outside of himself on other people. I mentioned this earlier, and this is woven in throughout Dan's review, which I appreciate, that so many of the people responding in Jeff's data do have this external locus of control. It's someone else's fault. It is their problem. They are the reason. They caused this to happen. I am the victim. This is a very kind of postmodern neo-Marxist approach to understanding and interacting with the world. Basically, woe is me. I've done no harm. I am oppressed and you are the oppressor. One final portion from Dan later on. He says, when we are presented with people's grievance narratives of their church experiences, we would do well to hold those narratives very tentatively and understand that other people can create very different and healthier narratives of those same experiences. My observation is that among Latter-day Saints, the way we process our experiences is largely determined by our depth of conversion. Deeply converted people generally bring very different resources to challenges, resources developed in adversity and struggle. Effectively, he's saying, as I understand it, and I agree, that if you've got shallow testimony, if you have shallow intellectual understanding of the church, when you confront these things, the Book of Abraham, or the church and LGBT, whatever, and like if you've deeply embedded in the gospel of Jesus Christ, if you have an intellectual understanding of these stuff, and you know the weaknesses of certain historical claims and the anti-Mormon whatever and the CES letter, if you've done the work, if you're firmly grounded, then I think you weather the storm far better. It's Helaman 5:12, right? If you're on the rock of Christ, then the arrows and the fiery darts and everything else, you can withstand this stuff. But it's people, it's the grievance narratives, right? External locus of control. The church did this, therefore I left. It's their fault. They shouldn't have done that thing, etc. That's not to say the church is perfect. I'm openly critical of various church positions and policies and things on this podcast. I am not here to ardently defend all of the traditions of our fathers as they're currently contained in church culture and the handbook and so forth. But the point is that notwithstanding all of that, I can be grounded on Christ. I can dig in and understand the history. I can base my testimony not on man, but on what God has truly revealed, despite the foibles of man. I can accommodate the many foibles of men, including the current men in charge, because that's not where my testimony lies. And that gets into the next section that I want to talk about, which is trust. We talked about this earlier. Jeff's point is that this isn't so much a faith crisis, it's a trust crisis. Jeff in the book writes about the morning that he learned his son was coming home from the MTC, I think like just a couple days into reporting the MTC. He gets a call, his son is coming home and leaving the church. Jeff writes, and I quote, "What I did not yet know that morning, but I would come to understand over time, is that what was happening was something more significant than an individual faith crisis. It was a trust crisis between a people and their church. When trust and belonging erode, even the most sincere belief struggles to sustain people spiritually, leaving many feeling unseen, disconnected, and hungry." Later in the book, Jeff writes, and I continue to quote, "Another common assumption collapses under closer examination, that people leave because they simply stop trying or become lazy. The data shows the opposite. People pray more, study more, serve more, seek the guidance of the Holy Ghost more. At first, when answers do not come, many assume the problem lies with them, that they lack faith, humility, worthiness, or spiritual capacity. This self-blame is often reinforced by a culture that teaches implicitly, if not explicitly, that good people do not have these kinds of concerns or needs, a persistent, inaccurate cultural belief." I think Jeff, again, might be over-indexing here on how hard these people dig in and how much time they spend in struggling, with these issues. Again, I can't speak for everyone, but my theory is that people are wanting to say that they look good, and he has a question in there like, how long did you spend in struggling with it? And people are like, I spent forever, and I did all this work to try and and clearly in many cases, I'm sure that's very, very true. But again, these are people voluntary reporting. We're told to trust them entirely based on things that happened years ago, and they want to make themselves look good, and it's a voluntary survey. So I think he might be a little bit too, I don't think it's totally say that all these people, they pray more, they seek the guidance of the Holy Ghost more. Some, sure. Many, maybe. Most, yeah, I severely doubt it based on at least my anecdotal observations. Continuing from what Jeff was saying in this few paragraphs. For a time, that assumption holds, often for years. People double down, they try harder, they wait longer. They quietly endure, but endurance has a cost. Over months and years, self-blame compounds, silence deepens. The effort required to remain present while withholding one's real questions becomes exhausting. Over time, the mindset begins to shift. As people continue to wrestle honestly, many come to a painful realization. The problem is not their lack of effort or sincerity. The vast majority spend countless hours over many years wrestling with their questions and concerns. The deeper conflict, Jeff writes, lies in the culture they trusted, a culture that struggles to engage questions with openness, humility, and compassion. That realization is often accompanied by grief and sometimes anger. Not the anger of rebellion, but the anger that follows the betrayal of trust. They slowly realize it is not they who are broken, but the culture that won't tolerate their questions. Wow. And I say wow because to me, this is the crux of the problem. These people who lose their testament, who lose their faith, and I'm not talking about the people who have struggles with the institutional church, but a deeply rooted belief in and commitment to, the restored gospel and Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. Like there's a contingent of those people, and I know many of them well. I'm not talking about those people who are just even closer to God and the restoration, despite the concerns about, the institutional church and leaders and policies and so forth. I'm talking about these people who are truly torn, who disaffiliate, who leave, who abandon faith, who join some other sect or go atheist, which is very, very common. And what Jeff writes, the wow is, I'll quote again, the deeper conflict lies in the culture they trusted. A culture that struggles to engage questions with openness, humility, and compassion. They realize it's not they who are broken, but the culture that won't tolerate their questions. These people placed their trust in man. They didn't realize, I guess, that fallible people make mistakes. Fallible people can be corrupt. Fallible people do stupid things. These people don't realize that it's not promised anywhere that there won't be apostasy in the church and tares amongst the wheat and foolish virgins amongst us and all the rest. Jeremiah 17:5, cursed be the man that trusteth in man and maketh flesh his arm. 2 Nephi 4, O Lord, I've trusted in thee and I will trust in thee forever. I will not put my trust in the arm of flesh, for I know that cursed is he. Cursed, not torn, maybe they're synonyms. Torn is he that putteth his trust in the arm of flesh. Yea, cursed is he that putteth his trust in man or maketh flesh his arm. DNC 1, the Lord's preface to the Doctrine and Covenants. Verse 19, the weak things of the world shall come forth and break down the mighty and strong ones, that man should not counsel his fellow man, neither trust in the arm of flesh, but that every man might speak in the name of God the Lord, even the Savior of the world, that faith might also increase in the earth. Not because of the arm of flesh, faith increases by direct testimony and access to the revelations of God. No wonder then we see this next data point from his book. Jeff, the headline here says, how did your faith transition impact your relationship with God and the church? And extremely lopsided. People, many, slight majority, 51%, are still close to God. Many of these people are leaving the church. They're going into other denominations. They're worshiping at home. They're disaffiliating entirely from the institutional church, not just ours, but all churches, right? So 51%. But 32% said negative. God, they're going atheist. They're abandoning faith entirely. But then you look at the church, 88% of people said that their faith transition had a negative impact on the church. Jeff writes, this divergence is critical. While this is not true for all who step away, it suggests that faith transition is not primarily a loss of spirituality or belief. It is often a loss of institutional trust. One respondent said simply, quote, I didn't leave because I stopped believing. I left because I couldn't keep pretending. And we could go through examples of violated trust. We could talk about DNC 132, as I have before, being altered right before its release, being promulgated years after Joseph's death, the quiet removal of DNC 1 that was included by common consent. We could talk about William Clayton's journals being kept from members. when it's such a critical underpinning of all of these things we are taught about Joseph Smith. We could talk about the 1886 John Taylor polygamy revelation that I shared on Amusing months ago, right? That was first denied, and then it was buried, and then it was quietly released. The first presidency denying that it existed, and then the document surfaced, and then it was quietly released. We talk about Elder Pullman's 1984 General Conference, The Gospel in the Church, that he was required to substantively edit and re-record, and, that was quietly inserted, hoping nobody would notice. We could talk about the SEC fine. Talked about this whenever it happened years ago, when the church was using these shell companies with their investment arm, and they were caught. What was their response? We affirm our commitment to comply with the law, regret mistakes made, and now consider this matter closed. Right? Like, when do we as individuals operate with that type of behavior? Oh, I regret mistakes made. I now consider this matter closed. You can't bring it up again. I now consider this matter closed. Don't punish me. No consequences. Don't talk about, So a lot of people struggle with that. That was a response for a lot of people, the financial issues and how these things are being done, that there is a perception amongst at least some church leaders that, well, if members knew how much money we had, they wouldn't pay tithing. Therefore, we got to quietly move this money around. That has implications when people find out about it. Other violations of trust, we could talk about Brigham and his buddies editing Joseph's journal to completely reverse his stance on polygamy, among other edits that they made. We could talk about faith promoting myths that are taught as truth and never corrected, like the transfiguration tall tale for Brigham looking like Joseph. We could talk about Thomas Marsh's milk stripping stories that's been quietly removed from the Come Follow Me manual. We talk about the happiness letter that people just say, oh, here's what Joseph said, even though it was from John C. Bennett, his enemy. And people just say, oh, Joseph said this. And all this stuff that people claim Joseph said or did that wasn't true. We could talk about Mormon meaning more good and being widely promoted, and now it's a victory for Satan, and people struggling with that. Was it good then and not now? And our church leaders not prophets because was Hinckley or was Nelson? Just this stuff hurts a lot of people if they don't have that firm anchor and they don't know how to process this. We could talk about the priesthood and temple ban for blacks, once taught as a direct commandment from the Lord, and then later the gospel essay saying none of these explanations is accepted. Past leaders explicitly said it was from God, and then current leaders are saying we don't accept that. People struggle with that. People struggle when interracial marriage was taught as an eternal law, Brigham and Spencer Kimball and a bunch of people in between, and now it's described in present tense as never being taught. The essay today says that the church does not teach that mixed race marriages are wrong, with no acknowledgement of the past. And so then people find out about the past and they're like, well, what gives? And is the church true? And our church leader is lying. And are they trying to cover? People struggle. Adam God, blood atonement, taught by Brigham for decades. It was later branded as false doctrine and heresy by President Kimball. Leaders claiming to see Jesus and beating around the bush. There's so many, and I've talked about I think all of these issues on past musings. And I bring them up like machine gun fire like that, in part to say, or maybe first to say, despite all of that, I have a strong testimony of the gospel. I believe God is real. I believe he called Joseph Smith to be a prophet. I believe Joseph restored the gospel. I believe the Book of Mormon is what it purports to be, and that God can and does work through man, and that we have the benefit of that restoration of the gospel today. But that doesn't mean that church leaders since have operated perfectly or have had everything they've done has been revealed from on high, or that there aren't cultural problems that have seeped in and the slow stain and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? So I bring all these up to say there is a path forward. There's absolutely a path forward to retain a strong testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ, despite what I'll charitably call missteps on the part of church leaders in the past, or inconsistencies, incongruities, whatever. But I can accept the fact that men are fallible and that the church remains condemned and has been since 1832, and that condemnation is not lifted, and that based on wickedness and idolatry and apostasy, the Lord closes the mouths of prophets, and we lack access to revelation if we are being condemned. And if we have not repented and remembered the new covenant, not only to say, but to do according to that which is written, etc., etc. So a lot of people encounter one or more issues on that list and like, oh, and they equate the church with the gospel, and then they throw both out. That was actually the topic of Elder Pullman's essay. If you haven't read it, you can go back and look at his 1984 original article before it was edited. They equate the church and the gospel. So when they find issues of church culture, or church history, or church leadership, and the gospel goes with it in their mind. Your foundation has to be on Christ, not men. I think that is the most revealing part of this book. That these people trusted the culture. The deeper conflict lies in the culture they trusted. They slowly realize it's not they who are broken, but the culture that won't tolerate their questions. I have no faith in church culture. I have no reliance upon church culture or broader culture. And I think therein lies the problem of so-called violated trust, that a lot of people aren't trustworthy. A lot of people make bad decisions. Some people are biased, whatever. Your trust should not be in culture. You should be doing the work to have a firm and faith testimony in God. Concluding thoughts. As I insinuated before, people generally leave for multiple reasons, not just one. Right? These are weighted differently for different people. You saw it with like, here's my primary percentage and here's my contributing this many people. These things are all just kind of intermixed. And in the list of reasons, I didn't really see any discussion. I guess it was a little bit in like maybe the social of people not really feeling the spiritual engagement, but I know a lot of people for whom church is just painfully boring. It's kind of the corporate, predictable, whatever. And I know a lot of people who stopped going just because they're not feeling that spiritual enrichment. I'm not saying their decision is right or wrong, but I know a lot of people that fall into that camp. But what I see as I look across Jeff's data and the summaries that he's presented is a lot of societal stain. And so much of this, I feel, is kind of the postmodern leftist secular everything. I appreciated this little snippet from Dan Ellsworth's review. He said that no amount of improvement of church culture can help Latter-day Saints who have authored their own exclusion and their own sense of non-belonging by embracing ideologies that are inimical to the restored gospel. And I think that applies to a lot of people. They've embraced political and philosophical and social ideologies and viewpoints and ideas that are inconsistent with the gospel. And they're trying to live a syncretic religion. They're trying to fuse the two. No man can serve two masters, but some of these people try. And then when they see the church as being rigid or the proclamation on the family or whatever, fine, I'm leaving. Again, that doesn't apply to everybody. None of this stuff is, we're painting with broad brushes here. But a lot of these people, I feel like, especially when you break down some of the data points, I think a lot of this is people are being heavily stained by our society. And then they're trying to reconcile that with an imperfect church and imperfect leadership and poorly told and sometimes inaccurately told church history, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of these people struggle. One other observation too is I think it's rare to see somebody leave their faith and find a lifestyle that requires more sacrifice. What was it from the lectures on faith? I don't have it exactly. It's a religion that does not require the sacrifice of all things, never can produce the faith necessary, sufficient to life and salvation. I probably got that like 90% right. Joseph Smith talked repeatedly about the need for sacrifice. And yet you see so often when people are abandoning their faith, when they have a faith crisis or a trust crisis, they're going from a point of greater sacrifice to typically a lower demand lifestyle, right? You don't see these people becoming more charitable and more socially, civically engaging and more faith promoting and more, it's why religious people, and particularly Christians, and in particular the Latter-day Saints, are more charitable, even just looking at financial, but also hours, like volunteer hours, than other religions or those of no religion. And so people typically descend down that sacrifice ladder. And when they leave the church, so it's not to say people are consciously telling themselves, I don't want to have to sacrifice as much time or money. Like they come up with They want to make themselves look good. So they external locus of control. The problem is elsewhere. The problem is you. So I think that's very common, and I think it's telling. These people may not directly divulge that that's what they're trying to do. That may not show up in the data very well because we're relying on voluntary self-reporting. So people are going to shift the blame and point to others rather than, yeah, I didn't want to sacrifice as much money or time, and I just, got sick of it, and I didn't want to do the work necessary to analyze and understand all these claims of controversy or corruption or church doctrine being wrong, etc. So I just accepted it, and that became the basis, by which I left. The final thing I think I want to say for now is that I think to God, it's more important the direction that we're heading rather than where we've been in the past. A lot of these people, as I said, just abandon faith entirely. It's one thing to have your struggles with the church or to reconcile your faith, but just turn inward and really focus on trying to dig deep and build a relationship with Christ and understand the truth. It's another thing to just accept things and move on and move down that ladder of sacrifice. And so many of these people just shrug and they abandon their faith. They change their lifestyle. They accommodate things that they ought not to. And I just think of, was it Peter, I think, that said when Christ was asking, where shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life. I think God cares about the direction we're going, not about where we've been in the past, the struggles we've had, the doubts, the controversies, the sin. To me, it's, am I building a relationship with God? Am I doing the work to understand truth? Am I remaining aware of the social influences that can undermine faith and my spiritual strength and relationship with God? Am I resisting the slow stain of the world? Am I observant to the influences that are wrapped with all kinds of not only philosophies of men, but justifications and excuses that make them palatable and appealing to reconcile in my mind? I'm not the problem, other people are the problem. That is a daily task. I am not perfect at it. But I think, if nothing else, having that inward locus of control, realizing that I'm not the victim, I'm not oppressed. Church leaders can do whatever they're going to do. Historians can say, scholars can say whatever they're going to say. People can blame Joseph or mischaracterize something he said or claim this Book of Abraham thing or blah, 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 right? But I have that inward locus of control. I can focus on what I believe and what I do with that belief. I can understand that I have agency, and that if I'm torn, if I struggle with anything, that's an invitation and opportunity to put in more effort, to go up the ladder of sacrifice and not down, to try and really understand the truth, not believe what someone else says, some podcaster, even me, not rely on someone else's characterization, but do the work. Research. Use your heart and your mind. Try and understand these claims. Dig in, not just rely on some podcaster or social media, whatever. I just feel like so many people have thin spiritual testimonies and even thinner intellectual foundations for any of their beliefs. And so it's little wonder to me that we see people so affected as we do. What is it in James, being tossed to and fro upon the waves, doubt not, because then you'll just be, people aren't anchored. And I'm not as anchored as I'd like to be by any means. But man, I just see people buffeted about by the winds of doctrine and the trends of social media and the claims of some scholar and the CES letter and the whatever. And I'm just like, I don't get it. Because that's fine. If you're looking for an excuse not to believe and not to affiliate and not to sacrifice, and plenty of people are looking for those excuses. I get it. It's very enticing to be stained by the world, to fit in, to have that syncretic religion that you can, I believe in a teddy bear God, teddy bear Jesus that just so, happens to believe in love, and me too. Therefore, I'm okay, and I don't need to change at all. And that is very much kind of postmodernism in a nutshell, and people are building a religion around it. Anyways, enough said. Have you read the book? Have you looked at any of the material? Let me know in the comments what you think. What's missing? What did I not focus on that I should have? Let's chat in the comments. I'll see you there, and I'll see you next week.